Uh, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on the Account Aggregator Framework, a multidisciplinary dialogue organized by the Law and Technology Society, NLSIU Bengaluru, along with the Indian Journal of Law and Technology. My name is Shubh Mittal, and I'm the convener of the Law and Technology Society. So for today's webinar, we have 5 distinguished speakers, and they are Mr. Rahul Matthan, Mr. Mahesh, Mr. Siddharth Shetty, Ms. Anubhutie Singh, and Mr. Vinay Kesari. Mr. Siddharth Shetty is a volunteer at iSpirit Foundation, a non-profit think tank focusing on building public goods for Indian product startups to thrive and grow. He has led the DEPA initiative in iSpirit and is an expert in the technical development and the functioning aspects of the account aggregators. Mr. BG Mahesh is the co-founder of DigiSahamati, a collective of account aggregators. He was one of the early technology entrepreneurs in India and has founded One India, a news portal that caters to 18 million people. Besides running an digital media campaigns, he has worked and is an expert in the technical development, functioning, and regulatory aspects of the account aggregators. Mr. Vinay Kesari is a general counsel and the founding team lead of policy and legal at Setu, a fintech startup working, among other things, on aggregators, account aggregators. He's an expert in the business and regulatory aspects of the account aggregators. Ms. Anubhutie Singh is a policy analyst at Dvara Research, a policy research institution focusing on finance. She has co-authored a working paper on account aggregators, analyzing the role of RBI in regulating the flow of financial information through account aggregators. She is an expert in the policy, data governance, and fintech aspects of account aggregators. Mr. Rahul Matthan is a founding partner at Trilegal and heads its TMT practice. He has written extensively on privacy and data protection, including his book titled Privacy 3.0, Unlocking Our Data-Driven Future. He has also a weekly column and podcast on technology, law, and policy on his Substack called Ex Machina. And we have finally Ankit Kapoor, a 4th-year student at NLSIU Bengaluru and a member of the Law and Technology Society, who will be moderating the session. I would like to thank all our speakers who have graciously agreed for the webinar despite their busy schedules. Now I would like to ask Ankit to start the discussion if he's ready.
Thank you for that, Shubh. And it's an honor for me to be among the company of such esteemed panelists today, all of whom have been advocates and proponents of this revolutionary technology. So I'll start by introducing our audience to the format that we're going to follow for today's panel discussion, followed by the speaking order. So we'll have each panelist speaking for about 7 to 8 minutes, followed by a panel discussion for about an hour, where we have around 15 questions across 4 themes. And we thought that in terms of order, we could start with the technology and the business side of this technology, and then move on to the legal and regulatory aspects. So perhaps we could start with Mr. Shetty, followed by Mr. Mahesh, then Mr. Kesari, and eventually we could move on to Ms. Singh and then Mr. Matthan. So if all the panelists are okay with that, should we proceed with Mr. Shetty?
Sure, sounds good. You can call me Siddharth.
Sure.
Sid, you can go ahead.
Hello. Sorry, it seems to have.
We can hear you, Sid.
Yeah. So the genesis of the Account Aggregator Framework actually started off a few years back, where we looked at how do we give individuals and businesses control of their data. And the reason this was important is, especially as you saw connectivity permeate hundreds of millions of Indians and businesses, and they started to generate data, various different types of data, government data, when they transacted as part of e-governance services, health data, and financial data. A lot of us are now using payment systems like UPI, all of which are generating these digital transaction trails. And we realized that if we really need to leapfrog in matters of financial and health inclusion, particularly, it's important that without giving these people control of their data, you're going to have one, very insecure ways with which they go ahead and share this information like they do today, whether it is shared through physical copies or physically running around to different branches that all of us experience, or digitally, you would go to different portals and download your PDFs and then upload those. Or even worse, you'd be giving out your username and password. In fact, many millions of users give out their username and passwords today so that third parties can access their data through a form called screen scraping, which is very primitive given the day and age of technology that we live in. And if you look at it, for example, in aspects of credit, the bank of today, just about 9 to 10% of MSMEs in India have formal access to credit. And one of the reasons why it's so limiting, and what the Bank of International Settlements found out, BIS is kind of like the central bank of central banks, is that this phenomenon exists actually not just in India, but even in developed economies across the world, Hong Kong and the US and so on, because the entire banking system is based on physical collateral. So if we need to create a shift from physical collateral towards the information capital, it goes back to the same point, which is how do you give people control of their data? Same in the health side. What all of us witnessed through COVID is you're seeing health diagnosis, for example, move to the back of one being driven by biomarkers, right? So you don't go to the doctor and explain your symptoms. Most people were asymptomatic. But you actually do a test that reveals a set of biomarkers that you then show to your doctor to diagnose, which is, again, completely data-driven. So therefore, it became imperative at the scale at which India is for 1.3 billion Indians to be empowered safely and securely with control of their data. And that's really how the data empowerment and protection architecture came to be. So it's a solution that you could think of it in 3 pillars, and I'll give a brief description of that. One is the underlying technology. So this needs to be designed on the back of open standards, open protocols, so that all the players can actually align and speak a common language. And those open standards for consent, how do you describe consent? What is informed consent? If I had to revoke consent, if I had to make it granular, a lot of the principles that the law, if some of you have read the draft data protection bill, talks about as informed consent, actually gets encoded in these open protocols. The second is, where does a user go to generate consent? You had 2 paradigms. One is the user could go to his custodian of his data, which could be a bank, and give consent, but then have to go to multiple such banks or mutual funds. Let's say you wanted to just visualize your finances, you're going to go to 4 or 5 places and it's a broken experience. Or you go to your consumer of data and give consent. And that's rife with misaligned incentives because the entity that wants to consume your data, like a lender, wants maximum amounts. So we therefore said we should unbundle consent collection from both the entities and place it in a third-party fiduciary, which are known as consent managers. And therefore, the account aggregator that you see is nothing but a consent manager for your financial data. And similarly, there exists consent managers for your health and many other categories of data going forward. So that's a real institutional innovation that India has come up with, where you have these fiduciaries, many of whom are already live in the ecosystem today as we speak, where users can go register, discover where their data resides, data stored in a completely decentralized manner. The identity behind this is also federated. That means there's no unique ID used in the system. The individual has the ability to collate and create a unique view, but that's unique to the individual. There's no use of, in fact, even Aadhaar in the entire architecture for privacy reasons. And then the user has a choice, almost like a postman. The consent manager is prohibited from storing the data and it's encrypted to facilitate the flow. And this unbundling has become extremely important. And that's what we're seeing globally as well with the shift now, not only in India, but if you guys tracked So a lot of you may have read about the Account Aggregator launch, but in fact, 2 days prior to that, there was an event that took place which had convened global policymakers, including Margaret Vestager, whose team had drafted GDPR and has now drafted the next set of data governance regulations. You had ministers from Norway and many other countries, representatives from Japan, Australia, and others, essentially convening to say, what's now been implemented in India, can we go ahead and globalize that? Fully recognizing the shifts that are taking place, one from data protection to data empowerment. The second, a shift from purely a legal-driven approach, which has resulted in market failures, towards a techno-legal approach. And the third is a shift from today each nation state kind of taking a siloed approach, and that has created jurisdictional arbitrage by different companies, much like in the world of taxation, and therefore the need to take a coordinated approach, coordinated at technology protocols, while allowing for extensions, regulatory extensions that are local to each country. And so that's, in a broad view, the mind map within which DEPA is rolling out. So I spoke to you about the technology, I spoke to you about the institutional framework, and the last is, in summary, the regulatory framework. So these principles underlying the entire consent model, what are called organs: open standard, R is revocable, G is the consents very granular, A is it's auditable, N is notice, and S is it's secure. These principles form the foundation of India's draft data protection bill as well. And once that bill gets passed, it will of course extend the system to many other categories of data, private categories of data like e-commerce and social media and so on. But in the interim, the rollout is already happening within the regulated sectors of finance, health, telecom, government data as well, which is now being made accessible with consent. And that being said, consent does not absolve the data consumers from accountability. And that means they are now even more accountable because they have tools, and it's very transparent saying this data was shared only for this purpose. So they are now responsible to ensure that it's only used for that purpose and nothing else. It's only stored for that period and nothing else. So that accountability remains, so that data is not processed in a way that harms the user in case consent was not informed. But you've actually created a system, an ecosystem that gives those users tools which otherwise didn't exist. And if they don't have the tools, they may have the rights, but it will never be operationalized. And so that's really where DEPA fits in. Hopefully that gives you guys a quick summary of the lay of the land.
Thank you for that presentation, Siddharth, especially that nuanced and in-depth understanding of the 3 layers involved within the DEPA protocols and how these 3 layers interact amongst each other. I think that's given us a lot of clarity and foundation to move forward. So with that, I think we can proceed with Mr. Mahesh to take it from here.
Yeah, thank you, Sid. I think, Sid has explained the whole thing extremely well. So the part which I have to explain is, far lesser, because it's actually a subset. So the account aggregator you all should see is actually the financial instantiation of the DEPA. DEPA framework, can be applied across any of the verticals, whether finance data, health data, travel data. It can be applied to any kind of data. And we in the account aggregator are now focused where the users are able to share specifically the finance data, whether banking, insurance, capital market, your pension fund, any of those. So we at Sahamati, which is a collective for the account aggregator ecosystem, not for account aggregators alone, for the ecosystem, which means we work with the providers of the data, the users of the data, the account aggregators, your technology service, your providers, and the most important folks. So the lawyers, we work even with you guys, on how this this all applies. The reason why I want to specify about why we have been working even with the lawyers for a year and a half is that now this entire thing about the data privacy, everything is fairly new. But now that we are implementing, rather we have implemented, this ecosystem has already gone live. So the amount of the usage of AA and how much the people are going to share their data will be so high that it becomes important that in all the legal contracts, they should be aware about this entire thing, like about the data privacy and that entire thing. So in view of that, we have also been working, with the lawyers. So, like about 15 days ago, this ecosystem went live. Like 8 banks are already ready with the implementation. 5 banks have actually gone live, and if you see with this 8 banks, like about 300 million bank accounts of information can be shared. I mean, we all get very excited when we hear from abroad, like one more framework, like about, only about 3 million bank accounts, the data is being shared. And we on phase 1, we are 100 times bigger. So this is something very important, because the entire framework from the start to finish was all done from India. It's a very great example of make in India, which is for make for India. Okay, that's it from me.
Thank you for that. I think especially the last lines that you mentioned really echo the heart of this project about how it's very indigenous, and that's something all of us here are quite proud of. I think with that technical understanding, we can perhaps now start understanding a little bit more of the business and regulatory aspects of this technology. So with that, I think Vinay is the best person to take it from here.
Thank you. So I'll actually start with some of the human aspects of this and lead on to the legal and the market, some of the legal and market issues that I think are very relevant. It's so, sharing of personal data is honestly one of the most pressing legal challenges in the world right now. So one of the dominant themes in the world is technology essentially as a horizontal force, right? Becoming more important across many different domains. It could be finance, it could be manufacturing, even healthcare. So technology isn't restricted into a vertical domain of its own. It is important horizontally across pretty much everything else. Now, as technology dominates the rate of change in all of these domains, these other domains which used to be in their own silos, starts to also accelerate massively. Right? So breakthroughs in, say, manufacturing or maybe even healthcare in the coming years that would probably have taken decades in the earlier world will soon start happening in just a couple of years. Right? So you can see this, for example, with electric vehicles. Right? We have had motor cars for well over a century. Right? But in just the last 5 to 10 years, the rate of change as EVs have started to move from an absolute niche to slowly becoming the mainstream to being at a point where you have a company as old and as large as Mercedes committing to move all electric by 2030, which is hardly less than 9 years from now. Right? That would have been unimaginable even say 15 years ago. But as technology has come to dominate the automotive industry, these kinds of changes and this kind of rate of change becomes possible. And this is going to happen across domains. It's certainly happening in fintech today, a domain that I'm very closely acquainted with. But as humans, our ability to manage these changes, to make sense of them and to keep track of them and make sure that these changes serve our purposes and keep our interests at heart, we aren't really keeping up, right? Because our rate of evolution and the rate at which our brains change is just not as quick. And that's not something that we can look to change immediately. So one of the challenges here is just the increasing amounts of information generated about us, shared across and between many different types of entities and used by them in so many different ways. Right? Some beneficial, some not so beneficial. Now, the average person, for that matter, even a legal expert, is just not equipped to process the implications of this data collection and sharing. So what are people doing in reaction to this? So countries are creating more and more laws to control what can be done with personal data, how it's collected, and they're also giving more rights to the end user, to citizens. Now, this unfortunately still leaves the user in a position where they are having to make informed decisions about consent. They have to keep track of what consents they've given, where it is being used. They have to utilize completely different mechanisms when it comes to managing these consents or revoking them, depending on which entity has their data. So, these laws, while they might exist on paper, are often not very useful in achieving the end goal of allowing you, the common user, to actually take control of your digital life, to take control of your data. And what that means and what that has translated to is a lot of the concepts we've heard, you would hear flung about in data protection discourse, consent fatigue, and a lot of the other issues that we are trying to solve for, often through better laws, better contracts, better regulation of entities in the way in which they present consents and take consent and so on. But what we aren't really doing in many of these cases is trying to fight technology with technology, right? What we need to do is use technology as an enabler for the user and create some kind of a regulated construct where people have digital tools that help them in managing the life cycle of personal data and data sharing. So that's what brings us to AA and to account aggregators. And that's exactly why I personally have been extremely excited about this idea, right, for quite a few years. And I'm especially excited right now because this very long journey that a lot of people have worked really hard on is finally seeing light, starting from about a month ago. Right. And, what AA does is present a very tightly integrated techno-legal solution to this entire problem. And I do believe that it is one of the first, if not the first, such type of solution in the world, right? Not just in the area of data protection, but more generally, when it comes to using technical tools to help solve some of the legal problems that are created by other technical tools, right? And that's really what makes it so momentous. And I think there are really, without getting into the details of breaking down the AA construct, and if required, we can do that later. The two big things that the huge innovations that actually three big innovations that I see the Indian approach to this making are one, the consent artifact, two, the fact that there is a separate entity that is created and licensed to be a servant of the user, and third, the idea of interoperability. So the first, the consent artifact is again the heart of this technical solution, because it presents a way to ensure that the user's consent is recorded in an unalterable way, which can be verified at any point in the future. This is the device that makes a lot of the rights that a person may have, a lot of the legal rights that a person may have, it actually makes it possible to really enforce them in a real way and in a cost-effective way, because the consent artifact is unalterable. It records every detail of the consent. It can be used to investigate misuse. It can be used for revocation. It can be used just so you know what all consents you've given. There's no one else who has really taken this approach, and I think that is the first and most important distinguishing feature. The second is the fact that AAs themselves have been created. Like, you could have the consent artifact and mandate the consent artifact without creating consent aggregators as well. You could simply create a standard and pass a law that says that any personal data sharing needs to happen on the basis of a consent artifact, without leaving the market to figure out who is going to actually operationalize all of this. But here we have an entity that has been created and licensed for this specific purpose, right? And I think that this, this is the right approach, in the sense that the user ultimately needs an ally that they can count on. And the fact is that incentives are not always aligned between either a financial information provider or a financial information user and the end user here. Right? So the AA has a legal responsibility to ensure that they serve only the interests of the user. And finally, interoperability. The fact that all FIPs and FIUs and AAs all need to be able to talk to each other through a common registry. The legal requirement or the technical requirement that they all be interoperable, that is also at the heart of making this successful. It gives this construct the best chance of success because it lets market forces operate. It means that people will have to innovate on product, that it will be very hard to leverage network effects and develop a very large moat by simply acquiring, say, a large number of FIPs or FIUs. We have seen consent or account aggregation intermediaries in other countries. There are companies like Plaid, for example, that have pioneered some of these ideas. But what has happened there is because that has happened in the absence of a regulatory construct, and particularly one that emphasizes interoperability. It's the kind of market that tends towards monopolies or duopolies, right? Which in the medium term are not great for the user. So here, the fact that interoperability has been mandated means that we have anticipated that possibility and we have provided for it. So these are, this is really what excites me about AAs and why I think they are something worth thinking about and working on. And I really look forward to the questions and comments that will come.
Thank you, Vinay, for that presentation, especially for adding that human touch to this discourse that we've been having today, and for walking us through some of those techno-legal solutions, which is really at the heart of this project, trying to fight technological problems through technology and using law as an enabler in that regard. So I think with that and that discussion on techno-legalism, we can probably start exploring the legal aspects and the policy aspects a little bit more. And with that, I invite Ms. Singh to continue this discussion.
Thanks, Ankit, and thanks everyone for your statements so far. I think in my statement, I will be covering topics of consumer inclusion in the system, their empowerment, and the underlying infrastructure that for evolving tech. And then I'll end with some regulatory observations when it comes to account aggregators. I think I will also kind of attempt to provide a more consumer protection lens to everything that I'm saying. So I think just to kind of, for completeness, we all already know that NBFCs, if I had to put it very simply, account aggregators at NBFCs whose purpose is to circulate and exchange information between requesting and providing parties with due consent from a given user for specific purposes. At the moment, account aggregators are only being designed for smartphones and for the associated front ends. If we really had to come down to it, account aggregators are a technological solution. Therefore, access to such a technological solution is dictated by those who have and do not have access to these prerequisites. And in this case, at this very moment at least, it would be either having access to a smartphone or a computer with an active internet connection. So we have noted across several policy dialogues over the years that access to ICT infrastructure such as telephones, networks, mobiles, computers, these are all prerequisites for digital inclusion at the very least. So while there have been significant improvements on this front over the last decade, I think there are several cultural patterns that have continued to persist. For instance, as of 2018, we know that the gender gap in mobile phone ownership in India was 26%, while the gender gap in the use of mobile internet use was even higher at 56%. In fact, a recent kind of in-house primary study that we did on access and use of mobile phones by women found that in India, a lot of women have access to phones, but it is often through somebody else's phone, usually the male member of the family. And if there is a household phone that is to be shared amongst everybody in the household, it is usually the men in the family that have the primary use and ownership of that phone. Moving on from just the gender aspect, I think if we just looked at smartphone usage or phone usage in India, There seem to be about 450 million smartphone users as compared to 550 million feature phone users. So when we talk, say feature phone, we really mean the button wala phone. And amongst those using feature phones, 40 to 45% of these feature phone users are using devices that cost less than 1,000 rupees. So we can imagine the kind of, say, features that these phones might have. On the other hand, obviously, computer ownership continues to be low, and it's at a mere 4.4% for rural households and a 23.4% for urban households. This was as of June 2018. So even if we were to consider the usage of the common service centers where local citizens, usually called the village level entrepreneurs, are contracted to set up internet kiosks in the rural areas. And the idea for such kind of centers was for rural citizens who might not have their own access to internet or mobile phones could go and kind of use all of the services that are being provided by the government at large. We know that there are serious penetration and sustainability issues. As of 2018, there were only 2.28 lakh CSCs functioning at the Gram Panchayat level. And there still remains like the plan of establishing about 2.5 lakh CSCs. This is about one CSC per Gram Panchayat remaining under the Digital India program. So even when these CSCs are present, as of right now, they are incredibly impeded by erratic network or hardware or internet failure issues. Now, if I had to put these two things together, I don't think I would be confidently be able to say that account aggregators or any other technological solution for that matter specifically enables and empowers marginalized communities if we had to talk about it. And it only further entrenches the barriers to access to resources that had already persisted. So while we talk about account aggregators empowering customers by letting them decide who they can or cannot share their personal information with, we have to understand that there are masses of populations that do not even have access to the channels on which this empowerment is happening. So I think as an urban, empowered, smartphone using citizen of the country, I'm incredibly excited to not like have my bank probably bothering me for putting together several documents to get a simple loan. But as somebody just in a peri-urban area with no smartphone, I think this makes no difference to me. And I will still kind of continue to go to the informal lender in my area to get a loan at very high rates of interest. And I think with this kind of opening statement, I'm just trying to take the focus from the users of account aggregators. And I'm obviously one of them, and I'm very excited for it. But I think the idea here is to not forget about those for whom we still have to continue to innovate. Then if I had to talk about enabling infrastructure, as consumer side experts, I don't have very strong views on the government or supply side policies. We do know that India's journey towards digitalization can be traced back to the 70s. And since then, there have been several improvements for the I think the National Informatics Center that was established. Then we had a couple of initiatives on the ICT front, such as the Rural Wireline Broadband Scheme and the Mobile Infrastructure Scheme. All of these kind of have been around and have been doing a good job of trying to expand the access to the infrastructures that enable access to all the kind of technological improvements that have been happening. I think the most recent one that I would want to call out, I think, is the government of India that has announced the GI Cloud, the Meghraj, which is an initiative to ensure optimal usage of IT spending by the government, while simultaneously giving the impetus to improve the adoption of e-governance initiatives using the cloud. So I will not assert that there has been or has not been sufficient kind of keep up by the government to provide the enabling infrastructure, but I can definitely say that it is part of the agenda. And I think that's a good thing, because as we see more of these kind of services come in, we have the account aggregators. There was talk some years back about a public credit registry, and we continue to see kind of technology building on top of technology. So I think the fact that the government at least is thinking about expanding access to the prerequisites is a good thing. Now, I think I'll quickly move on to the regulatory aspects. I think there was initially a lot of talk about how account aggregators are what are kind of bringing the open banking approach that we've heard of from the Europe in India. So the activities of account aggregators in India are somewhat similar to the account information service providers, that is the AISPs in other regimes. So they're quite similar. AISPs in Bahrain, for instance, that were released in 2019, they provide online service of consolidation of use of information of one or more accounts of a particular customer and gives it to them. Similarly, the AISPs in the EU under the Payment Service Directive 2 provide online services of consolidated information to customers, again, on any of the accounts that are held by them, with the option of sharing this information with payment service providers. Both these approaches were rooted in regulations and directives first, with technological providers and ecosystem entities priming themselves to facilitate the provision of these entities, very similar to what we've seen in India. In India, while the inspiration of account aggregators could have been that of open banking, at least from the very first mention that I can recollect, which was back in 2015 in an RBI press release, which stated that the role of account aggregators was to enable the common man to see all his accounts across financial institutions in a common format. Currently, I would say, and please panelists correct me if I'm wrong, but I would say that the services that are being provided by account aggregators are much wider than just giving a customer the consolidated view of information. So primarily, account aggregators are conduits of information between two regulated entities, the FIU and the FIP, where the account aggregator itself never sees any information. However, the manner in which this information is exchanged and can be accessed, as Vinay very well put it, either through one-time consent or enabling periodic consent by the customer. I think that is interesting, as it allows for a wider range of use cases for anybody who might be querying this information. Then, if we had to talk about kind of the laws that facilitated the laws in the context of account aggregators, and then if there have been any sectoral regulations or interventions so far. Again, we know that account aggregators were created as a joint decision between all the financial regulators in India, that is the RBI, SEBI, IRDA, and PFRDA. However, since then, we've only seen regulations and directions emerging from the RBI, and then obviously the tech arm of RBI, which is REBIT for the technical specifications. So as such, there have not been any interventions from other sectoral regulations, even outside the financial kind of realm. But we must note that as per the last circulated draft of the Personal Data Protection Bill, consent managers, which account aggregators are in the case of financial sectors, they are required to be registered by the Data Protection Authority. So if this registration kind of exists, I think we do see a strong kind of requirement for interagency coordination between at least the RBI and the Data Protection Authority that is to be built under the Personal Data Protection Bill, specifically with respect to the processes, the data flows, and the liability structure of account aggregators. I think that's all from me, and very excited to see the questions.
Thank you, Ms. Singh, especially for painting that very vivid picture of the socioeconomic context in which we're implementing this technology and the policies that the government has passed that also need to do a little bit more in widening that inclusion gap that we have right now. And also for introducing us to some of the sectoral regulations that are in place here. With that, I think we can move on to Mr. Matthan to explain to us the other legal and policy aspects of this technology.
Thanks, Ankit, and thank you for inviting me. Not thanking you so much for having me right at the end of all of these people, because my opening remarks are more like closing remarks now. Not much to say. But let me, just to spice up this afternoon, disagree violently with some of the things that Anubhutie said. Just, not because I disagree with her, but because we've got to have two perspectives on this. So yes, when we talk about technology solutions for social problems, one of the issues that keep getting thrown up is that technology is uneven, and when you apply an uneven solution to society, you're going to perpetuate the discrepancies that exist. And I don't disagree with that as a statement. But let me just contrast that with actual experience of the way in which things have been done in this country. And if you attended summit that Sid spoke about, where we had 7 countries actually, present their thoughts on techno-legal approach. One of the things, that the Indian delegate mentioned was actually quite striking, which is that this is the 3rd wave of financial inclusion in the country. The first wave was when we actually issued 300 million bank accounts. Now, Mahesh spoke about the numbers when we talk about these things, but at one shot in wave 1, 300 million. Then we had UPI, which democratized payment. And at each of these stages, the pushback was technology is uneven, and so there are people who are going to be further disadvantaged than they are. But today, UPI does 3 billion transactions a month. And we know that during the pandemic and the lockdown, the fact that people had access to digital means of payment gave them the ability to do things that otherwise just the circumstances of the lockdown would prevent them from doing. Now, what the Account Aggregator Framework offers is the 3rd frame of this inclusion, and that is the democratization of lending. And if you look at each of these in isolation, they don't seem to be much. But if you look at what each stage has done by building upon the other, you get a sense of how the acceleration happens. And then if you think about all of this in time, the UPI, when it was first launched, I mean, the government had to come up with this BEAM app, which was very clunky, and there were hardly any people taking it up, other than, I guess, all the tech geeks in this room. All of us must have signed up straight away, but other than that, no one was using it. And then with all the other apps coming in, it's just a hockey stick curve. So if you look at the volume of account aggregator transactions today, don't be disheartened, and don't think that this is any sign of the fact that people don't have the technology and so they can't use it. The fact is that we are at the beam moment of UPI when it comes to DEPA and when it comes to account aggregator. And if history is anything to go by, and often when I write, I actually try and look at history, because it's remarkable how if you find the right period, history actually predicts the future. And if you look at 3 waves of social inclusion, I sense that we are looking at another, sort of a Cambrian explosion, as it were, of things to do. So I'm not particularly concerned about the lack of smartphone penetration. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One is the UPI experience showed us that, first of all, smartphones are now not 50,000 rupees a smartphone. You'll get a good smartphone at 5,000 rupees that will have all the features that you need. And so when there is a need for it, I think people will get it regardless of where they are, and they will utilize it. And there are ways in which they can do it. The second is, obviously, the innovation will go down to feature phones as well. And I see no reason why, from a technological perspective, that will not be possible. The second thing that I think that we need to also keep in mind is that whenever we sit from this part of the table, which is looking forward at a future that is about to be written, we have many visions and imaginings of what it will look like. And history has always shown that it is entirely different. In fact, the innovations that we expect seem tame in comparison to the innovations that are created. And just yesterday, I was speaking to someone talking about account aggregator, and what would be your idea for an account aggregator. Vinay will probably just very quickly make an app out of this, so I want to tell him publicly that I'm telling him what it is. But essentially, what they did was they said, look, when I'm looking for a home loan, I know that, look, there are so many different, every month I have to provide information to the bank. It's just a pain. And, there's this floating rate of interest, and I'm really, the data asymmetry is not in my favor. So he said, with Account Aggregator, why don't I just pool together 50,000 such people like me, all home loan, borrowers. And why don't we all pool our data together such that we can get a better sense of what all the lenders are doing? And if we find that the lenders are actually being unfair, as in we look at what the lowest rate is that is available across that whole ecosystem, and can we as a pool, pool the resources, say 50,000 home loan, home borrowers are now swapping the entire pool, almost securitizing it yourself. So usually banks would securitize a bunch of borrowers. We will securitize ourselves to lenders and get the best rate out of all of that. Is that not an empowerment story? And would that have been possible if it wasn't for the fact that this data is available in this manner, in a completely fungible manner and automatically? So the simple submission that I would make is that as much as we think that we are, and as happy as we are with the innovations that we can imagine, the innovations that the market will create will surprise us even more. The final thing I want to say, because you asked me to speak about the regulatory and legal landscape, is that as Sid and everyone has been saying so far, this is a techno-legal approach, and I think that's perhaps from a contextual perspective, it's perhaps the wrong way to think about it. As a lawyer, and if we're all speaking to an audience of lawyers, I'd like you to think about this as smart regulations. Because our regulations and our laws say that we need notice and we need consent. But you can say it, and then if someone doesn't actually provide you notice and consent, your only option is the very unsmart thing to do, which is go to court. If someone collects your data and transfers it to some other person, they need to take your consent, they need to do it for certain reasons. And if they don't do it, the only only option you have is a very unsmart option of going to court. But if you use a technology framework to embed these principles of notice, of consent, of purpose limitation, and also of use limitation into the actual code of the transfer, what you're doing is you're creating smarter regulations. And that's why I think, at least as lawyers look at this, we should apply the lens of smart regulation to what DEPA is, as opposed to a techno-legal framework, which is what the technologists will think about this as. They will say that, look, this is a technology that I built because the law requires me to have this technology. Lawyers need to look at it and say, we've got laws, we can make them smarter by adding a technology layer on top of it. So smart regulations, and we've spoken about smart contracts for many years. We've spoken about how do we make smarter regulations. This, to my mind, is one of the very early examples of smart regulation at the cutting edge of where it is required, which is in the context of digital technologies. So I'll stop there and we'll look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Matthan, for providing us that alternative side to the points that Ms. Singh had made, and also for helping us think of this more broadly in terms of the relationship that law and technology should share. I think continuing from the debate that you and Ms. Singh had, which was on empowerment, that is our first theme of discussion. I wanted to come to Mr. Shetty first, and we really wanted to pick off from the idea that Ms. Singh and Mr. Matthan discussed about why there is a need for empowerment here. So starting on, could you provide us a good demographic and socioeconomic picture of why account aggregators and largely DEPA is required in India? Like, what kind of ground realities are people seeing that kind of drives the need for this technology in the first place?
Sure, absolutely. I think a couple of aspects come up, to just touch upon what Anubhutie mentioned before I dive in. One is the entire underlying system is based on a set of open technology protocols. What that means is, while you're seeing the first manifestation of them through a set of smartphone applications, because that's what the early entrepreneurs are going after, we do expect over a period of time more manifestations of those to be built. So those manifestations may take the form of feature phone applications. They may take the form of even assisted modes of giving consent. In fact, as we speak, there are a few entrepreneurs in the ecosystem building out assisted consent experiences that are informed, but the user does not, for example, let's say I don't have even a feature phone device, right? But I am going to a doctor in a rural village as part of a telehealth camp, right? And I had done a set of tests at the nearby city. My health data is residing in a bunch of places. Now, how do I share that with the telehealth doctor on the other end, right? And it's important that they get that aggregated view, and I don't have a phone. So what's now being built is you can have the operator in that telehealth can assist you by allowing you to register with an account aggregator, discover, link your data. Of course, this being translated to them in a way that they understand, contextualized in a way that they understand. The operator does not get access to the data as well, right? And it goes straight from the provider to the end data consumers on the other end. So that's an example of an experience, and you can, of course, apply it to the financial use cases as well that get built on top of these open protocols. So we do expect, and that's the push, because these are gaps that exist, and our view is these gaps, the way we look at it is these are all market innovations that should happen. So whether it's the assisted experiences, whether it's, let's look at the account aggregators themselves. Today, you see most of the account aggregators primarily focused on consumers, that is individuals. But you have MSMEs, you have larger enterprises, all of whom have very different workflow and user experience requirements. So if you look at the world of money management, right? If I'm an individual, I would probably use an app, let's say like Walnut or Mint.com. Those are very broken apps because they predate the AA system, but you would use something like that, right? If you're slightly larger than that, a grouping of individuals, let's say you're running a Kirana store, then you may use Khata Books or OK Credit. If you're slightly larger, then you would use, the distributor to those Kirana stores would use TAL. And then larger than that, an enterprise would be using SAP. All doing the same function, but essentially it's serving different user experience needs. So similarly, we do expect consent managers to come up, not just in the space of those that you see today, serving individuals or serving individuals in assisted modes and those types of experiences, but also consent managers serving MSMEs and enterprises. And those will be very, very different user workflows and authorization chains going forward. And I think that's very important. And that goes back to what Rahul said, is we have to take a longer term view, right? And therefore, what will happen is if we take that 10, 15-year view, initially you will have a set of entrepreneurs come and serve one set of the market, then you will have the next wave, then you will have the next wave. And then there will be, as feedback loops come in saying these parts of the ecosystem are not being solved for, people will find that a gap and go ahead and build applications. Again, either as consent managers, or many of those gaps particularly exist on the data consumer side, which relate to what are the new experiences, new financial products you could offer, because you've lowered transaction costs than you could offer before, right? Today, you have many MSMEs, in fact, using, being able to finance, being able to get just their purchase orders financed. So some of you are familiar with the government e-marketplace. These MSMEs at a time like COVID, banks completely shut off. Most of them did not even have access to formal working capital because it requires you to pledge some sort of physical property. And because they had the ability to consent and share their data, high provenance data, banks said, we lend to just that purchase order, we lend to just that invoice, right? And that's hugely important at that transaction level, because you've reduced those underlying transactional costs. So those are all examples of even new products that some of which we can't even conceive sitting here, much like when you design, the GPS standard or the internet standard, it's very difficult to conceive of how those innovations on top get built. But one of the underlying philosophies has always been, that's governing this architecture, is there's base public infrastructure, minimal public infrastructure, and then a lot of the variation for diversity in use cases gets built by market players on top, right? So the way we look at it is you are going to have, especially in India, given our diversity, you're going to have a widespread need in terms of user experiences, right? And there's no one application that can solve for that. There's no one company or one particular government service provider that can solve for that. And so how do you create the bare bones infrastructure that is minimal, but lowers the transaction cost so it makes it economically viable for a whole range of players to come together to solve those problems. And all of it will not happen right at the beginning. Even in UPI, it's still very much early days. As Rahul mentioned, 3 billion transactions a month, but it's still penetrating 150, 200 million users. We're a country of 1.3 billion. So these are still early days, right? And over a period of 10, 20 years is when this transformation will take place. And so the way we look at it is design the underlying architecture in a way that it promotes a diversity of problem solving. It gives the right amount of tools for entrepreneurs to problem solve on top, rather than all of that thinking being baked into one particular solution and trying to get that solution, hammered through the system, ran through the system, and adopted by everyone, which is just not going to happen, and it's not really conducive. So that's really how we've looked at the problem of the widespread demographics that exist. That means even for things like languages or different levels of abstraction in consent, depending on the literacy on the other end, all of that can be built on top of these open protocols. And that's the choice that the user and their respective fiduciary really make in the system.
Thank you for that, Siddharth. If I could just pick Mr. Mahesh's brain also on the points that Siddharth had raised. And just on that, Mr. Mahesh, if you could also give us a sense of what the state of the industry is like right now. You had mentioned in your presentation that 8 banks are already ready and 5 have gone live. But what is the status of some of these other stakeholders on the ecosystem?
No, it's like, as I informed, with these 8 banks, it is already forms or covers about 40% of the banking system. So now you will see, I think by even end of the calendar year, a few more large banks will also join. Many NBFCs will join, and now it becomes important, and now it is the right actually time for us to go across sectoral, because of all these 4 sectors which we are on AA, which is the banking, the NBFCs, the insurance, pension fund, and the capital market. We will all agree that the highest penetration you see is in the banking system. The number of people who have the bank accounts is surely more as compared to the number of people who are insured in the country. So in a way, it is good. These 8 banks are on this ecosystem. So now, as we go forward, now we as Sahamati will have to focus to get more and more of them onboarded onto AA. All that sounds good. I think the most important part which we'll have to work on is on developing and working with everybody on the use cases. The use cases are important. If the use case is there, then this infrastructure will be used. See, of course, we have heard about lending and all of that, which has been happening. Without AA also it has been happening, but with AA it will improve a lot more. But if we are able to come out with more and more completely out of the box use cases, if we go and do a plastic surgery for the existing use cases, you will not see like any huge change. It has to be from scratch. We have to get design in these things, and that will happen only if we understand what is the problem we want to solve. We should not have a solution and go and try to find the problem which is solved. Understand what are the issues, what are the gaps which are there in the market, and as we go forward, we'll have to work on the provider side, on the how the FIUs will be able to use, and most importantly, we'll have to focus on the consumer.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I think now that we have a clearer understanding of the supply side of some of these empowerment issues, I just wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit more about the demand side of this empowerment, particularly the debate that Ms. Singh and Mr. Matthan were having. So my takeaway was that both of them agree that the urban middle class to low income citizen in India would probably benefit a lot from account aggregators, which is probably what most of us today here are. Really the heart of the disagreement between the both of them was the extent to which two issues. One is access to hardware, which is your phones and broadband. And second is the information asymmetry, the extent to which this could impede the successful operation of the account aggregators. So I wanted to come back to Ms. Singh and allow her the opportunity to respond to some of the points that Mr. Matthan had made in this regard.
Thank you so much, Ankit, and thank you, everyone. I think I would like to start by saying that the appeal to think about users who may not have been covered yet should not be considered as an opposition to the technology itself. I think it is by keeping in mind that there are still users who might not have been kind of thought for, is how we've been able to move past kind of creating for these solutions in the past. Since we did speak about UPI, I think, Rahul, you're very correct in saying that there were things and transactions that users were able to undertake during the COVID lockdown that they otherwise may not have been able to, simply because of how accessible the technology of UPI may have been. But I also want to kind of point the audience towards another technology solution that existed for those users that may not have had access to a smartphone, which is required for a UPI transaction, which is the Aadhaar-enabled payment system. We know in the very big Aadhaar-enabled payment system, again, it does not require a smartphone. It can work with your very basic button phone, and it only requires the user to know their Aadhaar number. But in the starting of the lockdowns, when we saw a lot of exodus of migrants, we know there were very high failure rates experienced for AEPS amongst different financial providers. And the sole reason for this was because nobody anticipated the such high volumes of use within the AEPS. And that's the exact kind of point I'm trying to make, which is that when you only focus on a certain group of users with whom account aggregators may be working properly, I think it's important to not forget about those we aim to empower and aim to kind of provide credit to and improve lives of. Which is why I'd like to thank Siddharth. Thank you for pointing us to the innovations that are happening, especially in the assisted tech kind of account aggregator system. Internally, we've been having several conversations with innovators who want to create, say, voice-assisted account aggregator systems, or systems wherein you might not even require a phone, as Siddharth very correctly mentioned. I think that is all with respect to the I think the points that Rahul had made, and I don't think it was very much a disagreement, as he would have thought, I suppose. I think just otherwise, I would like to kind of, no, actually I'll close. That's all, thank you.
Right, thank you for that, Ms. Singh. I think given the reference to Aadhaar, it's almost incumbent on me to invite a comment from Mr. Matthan, who's also very closely worked with that technology. Would you agree with that comparative that Ms. Singh has made, Mr. Matthan?
Look, I mean, technology will fail. Human beings will fail. Systems will fail. But because there is a chance that technology will fail and systems will fail, doesn't mean you don't build those systems. Because the fact that we have these systems allowed these sorts of payments to get to people who otherwise would not have got access to them. And I think one of the aftermath of the initial COVID lockdowns, something that the world never thought they would have to face, one of the big questions that countries were asking was, how can we get these digital systems? We need digital identity systems. We need digital payment systems. And if countries don't have digital payment systems, we have to build them quickly, because we need to use them at times when the other systems don't work. I don't know if you know this, but Europe is in the process right now of a Digital Identities Act. They're looking very closely to try and figure out how they can integrate identities across the union. Countries in Africa are looking, many countries are rolling out MOSIP, which is in a sense Aadhaar in a box, which is being rolled out all over the developing world for this purpose, to provide identity solutions. So I think I think it is inevitable that systems will fail, and I think we must identify these failures and try and ensure that the failures are minimized and limited. But we can't allow that to be the reason why we don't build these things. And I don't want to minimize the hardship that results from people who depend on technology not being able to access it, because certainly that is high and it should not be ignored. But at the same time, I don't think that should be the reason to not build these sorts of technologies, and that's sort of the fine point that I want to make on that.
Right. I think that strategic approach probably positions us best to take or balance the harms and the cons that come from this technology, and really helps us to think of this project in the long term. Speaking of the long-term benefits of this project, I wanted to come to Vinay and understand from him, how is it that we as users can maximize the value that we generate from account aggregators? Are there any factors or strategies that we can use while transacting?
Sorry, before coming to that, I raised my hand because I wanted to add a point to what Rahul was saying, which is that,
please go ahead.
The other thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about whether AAs in the way they're architected, the fact that right now they're available only on smartphones, whether that can lead to exclusion. I definitely agree that the emphasis should be on making this more inclusive over time. So we shouldn't lose sight of that, and it is a very important motivating factor. I agree with Rahul that that doesn't mean that we shouldn't implement this right now and that we should wait for it to become perfectly inclusive before we implement it. The other very important thing to keep in mind is that AAs are only an additional tool to get access to information or give other people access to your information. Nobody is envisioning AAs as replacing any of the existing methods. It is only an additional method. We work with a lot of banks and fintechs and NBFCs and so on who are all looking at AA and very excited about it. Not a single one of them want to replace any of their existing methods with AA. They want to add AA. When it comes to trying to assess whether you can lend to someone, a lender is only looking to widen the funnel. They are not going to use a technology that will narrow that funnel even by 1 or 2%, because someone who might otherwise be a worthy borrower does not have access to that technology or is not able to use it. They are always going to also allow people to submit physical documents, to upload a PDF version of a bank statement. That is the way these workflows are going to evolve. AAs will be one additional way. I don't think it's anyone's interest to replace everything with AA or remove even one of those methods right now. But to go back to the question that you just posed to me, I think so. There are one, AAs are in a nascent stage. So I think we'll again have to watch and see how this ecosystem evolves to give a complete answer to your question. But one way that I see this evolving, and the way I hope it will evolve, right, is that AAs will hopefully allow people to do what is in the name, gain an aggregated view of their accounts and therefore their financial life, and start with that. And that should ideally lead to tools that help you take control of your financial life and help you be better with your money. And I'm not talking about, and what excites me here is not, can the millionaire, milk a few extra percentage points out of their portfolio? No. The fact is that most of India is very poor, right? We are an extremely poor country, and we must not lose sight of that fact. It is also a fact that it is very expensive to be poor. It's expensive to be poor because many types of products and services which you can easily access as an affluent person, which help you smoothen out your financial life, right? This could be credit, this could be insurance, right? All of these are very easy to access when you reach a certain level of affluence, but are very difficult to access when you are poor. And it's difficult to access when you're poor, one, because you don't have that corpus of funds, at your disposal that help you kind of set that ball rolling. It's because of a lack of awareness, and it's because you don't have access to someone who can help you figure these things out. There is a huge lack of information. Now, what I really hope can happen is that the the person on an 18,000 rupee a month salary, right, is able to, using AA, give some kind of a tool or a service, insights into their cash flows, and that this person, this company, this tool will be able to, using that easily accessible data, help them make better financial decisions, which let them access these products and services, which let them live closer to the way you and I live. Right? So that to me is really the idealized vision of what AAs can lead to, because not everyone can have access to a personal financial advisor, but it's definitely possible for there to be a robo-advisor focused on gig workers, who understands the financial lives, the cash flows, the problems that the financial problems that a gig worker would often face, and help them figure out how best to mitigate those risks. All of us, even the most educated and affluent amongst us, often make bad financial decisions. We are not rational actors when it comes to most long-term decisions, and especially long-term decisions when it comes to money. I'm sure all of us have experienced this in our financial lives, right? So the difference is that we have the huge safety net of privilege and a lot of money and access to advice, which most people do not. So how do we make that accessible? And I think that is ideally the way people should be able to use AAs. In addition to that, of course, there is the fact that you can view the consents. I mean, there's the whole data protection angle and taking control of your data. But I would say that that's important, but that's actually secondary, because there are much more pressing problems that AAs should ideally help Indians solve, and India as a whole solve, right? And I really hope that comes true.
Thank you for that illuminating vision of what account aggregation could look like in the future. With that, I want to move on to the last question that we have under the empowerment theme and post that to Mr. Mahesh. Typically, the Make in India approach has really focused on the manufacturing sector, but account aggregation, as we have seen, which is an indigenous solution, has helped boost activity in the service sector, like some of our panelists have mentioned, through upstream and downstream services like Reddit. Drawing from this, we wanted to understand if achievements in the Make in India approach, if they happen in the service sector like they are with account aggregators, is that actually more beneficial? And what do these indigenous developments actually mean for the larger policy ecosystem going forward?
So I would say it is very important, okay, for India to solve the issues on its own. Okay, which means we have to figure out the problems which are out there, and it is only we who will be able to design the solution. Now, say for example that I think even Sid had informed that the MSMEs in India, like only 8 to 10% have access to the formal credit. So we know about the problem, and then an ecosystem, I mean, a framework like AA, if you design the use case where you use the information from GST and from the bank statement to come up with a product like a cash flow lending, it actually solves the problem. So we'll not be able to solve the problems we have in India by using some solution which is there from abroad. Okay, to start with, I don't think anybody has across the globe anything which can solve a problem. In fact, now it has become the other way, as both Rahul and Sid spoke, that there are 6 to 7 countries who are seeing what we have done. I'm not telling everybody will have to fully copy what, but they surely see what we have done in DEPA is a very good starting point, even for them to like actually have a branch from that and do something for their own country. So I think India has to show the government or the policymakers, the regulators, and the market players, when they all combine and work with each other, we are able to solve the issues, the problems we have in India. And as I told earlier, it's very important that the Make in India is not only for export, it is also to solve the issues we see in the country. I think Siddharth wanted to say something. Sid?
Yeah, thanks, Mahesh. Just to add on to what Mahesh was outlining, I think a couple of aspects come up. Firstly is we have to take a very first principles view of the problems that exist in India, right? So it's not a case of not invented here. If it just cause the technology hasn't been invented in India, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't use it, right? But it's important to take first principles view to say, what are the real problems that exist? When you're solving for 1.3 billion people with a large amount of diversity, with a very different state and market balance, what are those problems? Then when you apply that lens and you say, do the existing frameworks out there go ahead and solve those problems, you start to realize that in certain cases, like in the case of data, the answer was completely no. In fact, when we embarked on, this was very clear to us, but when we embarked on this journey 5 to 6 years back, at that point in time, I think GDPR had just about come out, right? Or if I remember correctly, and most people said, why don't you just copy GDPR? That's the gold standard that exists. Why shouldn't, most of the lawyers were of the opinion that GDPR exists. They were clamoring around GDPR. In fact, you would see major op-eds issued on how GDPR versus the India model, and therefore why GDPR is better, and what's wrong with folks out here. Clearly, GDPR seems the best. And then you had a moment of reckoning where you had Margaret Vestager just a few days back essentially say that GDPR has failed, and that's why they're creating a new set of regulations to bridge some of those gaps, right? So the reason why, now how do you understand that? How do you take that in? How do you factor that in? The only way that's possible is if you go back to first principles. And if you then say, okay, do those right legal constructs exist? If they don't exist, create them. The open source world, for example, created their own legal constructs and licensing system around how do you use it, how do you reuse it, something that's provided for free, how do you drive accreditation, derivative works. So there is a need to actually think about these problems individually, immerse yourself in those problems, and then be bold and ambitious enough to say, hey, if solutions don't exist that fit these problems, we'll go ahead and solve for it. And if they do exist, then we will use it, lock, stock, and barrel. But if they don't, we at least will solve for it. It might be a journey where a couple of years or even longer, where there's often a contrarian view that none of this will work out, but eventually the best solution, the way society works is some of those best solutions end up percolating to the top. The second thing, I think, why it's important for India is if it does go on to become successful, not just in India, but globally as well, this becomes a way to actually enforce a soft power across the world. So it also becomes, especially from a foreign policy standpoint, this becomes, India's soft power in these relationships. And it's a form of soft power that cuts across a lot of otherwise nasty geopolitics, because you have the same problems that exist within China, within the US, within the EU, who otherwise are, operating at different ends of the spectrum on a whole range of other issues, right? So it actually becomes a way to grow India's foreign policy strength, and also a way for companies in India that have built in accordance with this system, and that even includes other actors in the ecosystem like legal agencies and others, to now travel to other parts of the world, right? And that's how a lot of technology has been globalized. Nokia and Ericsson built in accordance with the GSM standard, so they were able to travel across the world. The technology that powers Airtel in India or Jio in India on the back end is a Nokia and Ericsson system. Or when it comes to 5G, Huawei and equivalents. So that's a common playbook. And I think it's important that India embraces that playbook, because for far too long, even in technology, we have ended up copying our own solutions from other parts of the world. And then, for various reasons, primarily because we can't deal with the messiness, right? Because when you're creating a new solution, there are lots of questions asked. Remember, the questions that are being asked about Account Aggregator now, 5 years in after a successful launch, you had even more questions, fairly existential questions being asked a couple of years back, right? Will banks even come on board? Mahesh talked about 300 million banks. For the longest time, most people were like, will any of the banks come on board, right? I don't see logically why would any bank come on board. right? So I think it requires that capacity, and hopefully some of you take this from the conversation that we're having today, is to actually live in that messiness. Otherwise, we're often used to completely furnished solutions being made available, even existing contracts, existing legal constructs, right? And then build on top of that. But I think in certain cases, it's a lot more valuable to build those from scratch, embrace that messiness, and maybe over a period of time that messiness starts to clear up, and you have a very wonderful solution that gets built on top. And so I would say that's the other perspective, to just add on to what Mahesh said, of why this is important, beyond just, of course, the tactical data empowerment elements behind this.
Yeah, thank you for providing us that geopolitical perspective in addition to the socioeconomic perspective that already has been discussed. I think your point on looking at India's needs and contextualizing those as sort of the foundation for policy making is a great segue for our next session, our next theme, which is public digital infrastructure. So just on that, I wanted to ask Mr. Mahesh on the larger public infrastructure project that the Indian government has followed, which is known as the India Stack project. So could you walk us through what the layers of this project are? Where does the account aggregator exactly fit within this context?
Sure. Okay. I'll do briefly, because even in the interest of time, I don't know how detailed I can go. But see, you should see India Stack as India's digital public infrastructure. Now, to explain to you a simple one, like, all the email applications have been built on a digital infra known as SMTP. You have the SMTP, which is the infra where it is everybody follows that framework / the protocol to send and receive emails. And above that, you have folks like Gmail, Yahoo, or Hotmail. Everybody on all those are built. The other good example is GPS is a digital infra, and above that is what the Google Maps has been built. Now, India Stack, you can say, mainly has the 3 layers. Digital identity, which you all are familiar with. On Aadhaar, what has happened is you were able to make use of it to open a lot more bank accounts. And folks have used it to share their KYC documents, the eKYC, the e-sign. Then you have the other layer, which is the payments layer, where of course we all use is the the UPI framework, on which the several popular apps have been built, PhonePe, GPay, Bheem, and all of that. And that entire infrastructure is handled by NPCI. The third layer, which is the consent layer, is the one which in this entire session we all have focused upon. It is that we know that the data is out there, and we have to share this information. But now with this, the consent artifact, which is actually a part of this layer, you are able to share your data for a particular purpose. You can say for a particular time period. And the other important thing is that you are able to revoke a consent also. So for a change here, the end user is in a complete control of their own data. So it is extremely new. So until now, what was happening? It was the corporations who had access to your data, and they were selling their services and their products to you. To give an example, browse the net, they know with the help of cookies, which will soon end in a year or two. They knew your actual interests, and the appropriate ads were being shown. But how was the end user benefiting? So he was not gaining financially. So now it is only with the account aggregator and the consent layer. What happens is, now each of us have the full control on our data, and we decide what data of ours with whom we are going to share and for what purpose. So if I have to summarize, India's stack is fully paperless, presenceless or contactless, and most importantly, it is a cashless layer. And for those who want to know more about India Stack, I would say that please go and visit indiastack.org. It has all the information.
Yeah, I think that gives us a perfect background to understanding India Stack, which is quite relevant for the next question that I have for Ms. Singh and also Mr. Shetty. I wanted to understand from the both of you, and Ms. Singh sort of made these points earlier about how there's limited access to physical hardware, like the smartphones that we've been speaking about. I wanted to understand if you think that the Indian government has passed adequate policies, both in terms of the existence of these policies and the scope of these policies, to address some of these inclusion gaps that exist, firstly over hardware and also maybe over software like the cloud. Ms. Singh, if you could go first.
Sure. Yeah, so as I said, I don't have very strong views on this, but I do think that ever since, I think digitization has been a strong kind of mandate for the Indian government. If I had to, I think just as a researcher, we tend to kind of pull out all the dates and the facts. So if I just had to run you through a history, I think the developments can be traced back to 1917, when 1970, when the NIC was established, and the primary role of NIC was to provide ICT applications for public admin and facilitate electronic delivery of government services. So the creation of this NIC network was really somewhat the first effort towards digitizing government records and laying, most of the foundation of what we know as digital India today. So ICT projects, infra projects such as as I mentioned, the wireline broadband scheme, several others, they were implemented under what was called the Universal Service Obligation in the 2000s. So in addition to all of these kind of schemes for digitization towards the public delivery system, I think there were also the mobile telephony developments related to the progression of 2G to 4G under the National Telecom Policy. And all of these have obviously played a role in kind of deepening digital inclusion. Again, in 2006, there was the National E-Governance Plan, the NEGP, that was launched with 27 mission modes. Now, these MMPs, again, they had similar kind of agenda points, which was establishing countrywide infra, promoting large-scale digitization, and providing citizens with reliable access to government service over internet. So a lot of what we know as CSCs today, for instance, that was a huge part of this. Again, in 2014, I think NEGP 2.0 was kind of brought out, because despite all of the efforts that had been happening before this, there was an increasing number of obsolete and fragmented e-governance projects, and there was also very poor kind of uptake of the services that were provided earlier. So I think within NEGP 2.0, the key kind of first principles were introduction of these integrated services. Then there were cloud technologies, language localization. And the broader goal was really to deliver digital kind of services to consumers through integrated and interoperable systems. And that's also kind of where we get a lot of our impetus for interoperability amongst technology systems in India today. So I would say, so as of right now, I think we're obviously, everybody on this panel knows we're seeing a lot of developments, not just from the government or the tech policy side, but also I think regulatory wise, we've been talking about the personal data protection bill, I think ever since 2000, ever since the Sri Krishna committee was kind of established. But if I had to talk in absolute numbers, I think that would really defeat the purpose of the kind of answer you're seeking from me, which is that despite all of these efforts taking place, I think we do see kind of a gap between the ownership numbers, between the access numbers, and obviously you have this coupled and intersected with all of the cultural barriers that you've seen. So if I just had to merely talk about the government side, sure, I think they definitely have this in their agenda, and I think they're doing as good a job as they're able to with that.
Yeah, just moving to Siddharth there. And Siddharth, I especially wanted to understand from you, what role do you see the private sector playing in this regard? So at the top of my head, I can think of the work that Reliance Jio has done, both in terms of access to low-cost smartphones as well as the cable that they've laid in a lot of rural areas. So is that the extent to which you see private sectors being limited?
Yeah, so I think, Anubhutie did cover a really good overview of what the state side push has been so far, including the laying of fiber optic cables and many other enabling policies that they've put in place. And I think it's a fine balance between that and private sector act, because excessive state involvement creates its own set of unintended or sometimes intended consequences as well. And I think that's where one, thinking about some of these gaps and these gaps being addressed, one could be by private entrepreneurs in the space or by collectives of these market players that take a longer term view. So I think that's where it's quite fascinating to see Sahamati exist, because for the longest while, especially when you're building out new infrastructure, you need cooperation between competing players. And most of the forums that exist in India so far, which brings together competing players, have been forums or associations that do nothing but lobby, right? The unfortunate sad state of many of these associations is all they are primarily interested in is to lobby with policymakers to increase this rate or decrease this rate, right? And it's a very, very sad state of affairs. And that's also why they lack a lot of trust with policymakers on the other end. I think it's quite fascinating to see Sahamati in that regard, be one example and an attempt, I would say, time would tell. But so far, it's been able to house what are otherwise very stressful conversations, for example, between banks and NBFCs, between private sector banks and public sector banks, because as you'd understand, it's non-trivial for banks to actually open up their data. So all of those conversations anchoring people over the longer term to make the system lower cost, to make the system more accessible, to ensure that the right set of consumer protections are built, to ensure that the right set of grievance redressal mechanisms. So for everything we cannot be, we seem to be a society where we run back to the state. But in our own bedroom, in our own halls, where we're actually having conversations saying, but the state can't do anything. But when anything bad happens, we run back to the state, right? So it's this very weird behavior that we have at play. And I think therefore alternate kind of institutional setups need to be built. Over and above, of course, individual private players, be it Geo or a whole range of them, actually solving for very specific interests in the market, right? And I think we need more of that institutional capacity to be built out. Also because many of these things are very fine-grained in nature, right? So you can have, the government can create a policy like they did in the case of broadband, saying let's lay fiber optic cables to every village. But most people, what ended up happening is at the end of the village, at the end of those cables, no one is using the internet because they're saying it's too expensive, right? So now there is an effort, again, a balance between state and market players, which the Prime Minister announced recently, called WANI, the wireless access network interface, where it basically attempts to unbundle the last leg of connectivity. So someone could be an entrepreneur and just provide a modem, someone could provide a consumer app, someone could provide electricity and all of those things. And then all of these players could come together to create a public Wi-Fi hotspot, each one making money for their part of the activity. And that would not be possible only, again, with government intervention, although the problem statement is very clear and the policy intent is very clear. So I think we need to look at addressing these gaps in the market in a lot more nuanced manner, saying for this gap, to this extent, government intervention is useful. Beyond that, there should be maybe other institutional setups that anchor those. And then, of course, you have private players solving for a thinner sliver of those individually.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that the problem shouldn't just be limited to individual entrepreneurship, but also institutional level. And I think hopefully the thinking can proceed in that direction. With that, we would probably move on to our third theme here, which is the regulatory advantages of the account aggregators. And I want to start with Mr. Matthan here. So in my understanding, the shift in data protection and governance in the past few years, at least, has been from like you said, this sort of quote unquote techno-legal approach or smart regulations, wherein we try to use the technology itself as a way of regulation. And I'm specifically talking about the concept of privacy by design, or concept which is recognized both in the PDP bill as well as the GDPR. Can you enlighten us on what exactly this concept entails and how the account aggregators design features achieve this objective?
Sure. So look, privacy by design predates the GDPR. Privacy by design was first conceptualized by Anne Kevorkian, who was the privacy commissioner in Canada. She came up with this concept of being a little more intentional about privacy, so do it upfront as opposed to do it in a reactive way. And I think so essentially the concept of privacy by design is that you have to build privacy into the design of your application, your technology, so that that is the default, as opposed to a situation where you have to actually search for it and then build your own privacy. And in that sense, when Anne Kevorkian came up with it, it was a very passive concept, because some of the best examples of privacy by design is that if you have a button which says, I would like to receive newsletters, I would like to receive more information, most applications had that pre-checked as yes. And when you go down to that application, there are very few people who will actually go and uncheck it. They would just say, I agree, and carry on. And what Anne Kevorkian said was that's wrong, because you have actually, by the design of your application, made it non-privacy friendly. You are, the design is such that people will just go and say, I agree. And if that is the case, by just having it pre-checked, you are almost tricking them into accepting this privacy invasion. And so the early phase of privacy by design was this sort of passive design of applications. And I don't blame her, because that's the evolution of things. It's also perhaps this sort of technology wasn't possible. But we today actually have the ability to be more intentional about the privacy frameworks that we built. One of the earlier examples, even before DEPA, for privacy by design in the Indian context is actually the UPI bank mapper. Because what is the UPI VBA doing? The virtual address that you have, which is Rahul at OKHDFC or something like that. What that does is, with a very simple, reusable name, you can actually map the bank account to which you want money to be sent and from which you want money to be transferred in a privacy-preserving manner. Because I can share Rahul at OKHDFC to anyone, and I have no fear that that person who has that information will actually know what my bank account number is. And that is an innovation which is intentional privacy by design, when you've built the system to actually have this two-layered approach. In a similar way, DEPA is the next instantiation of privacy by design in a technology infrastructure that's been actively designed with privacy in mind. There are sort of many ways in which they do it. I think Sid mentioned earlier the organs framework. And I like the organs framework because the elements of the organs framework, which is the fact that it's built on open standards, it's revocable, it's granular. People who have read my writing, and some of the students who I can see in the audience will know that I like the concept of granular consent as opposed to this bulk consent that we get when we sign up to privacy policies. It's auditable. Notice is provided, and it's secure by design. So the organs framework essentially is, if you look at the GDPR and if you look at the privacy principles in the GDPR, if you look at the PDP bill, you look at the privacy principles in the PDP bill, and look at pretty much any privacy legislation, you will find that the organs, maybe it's not written in this clever acronym, but those principles are core to privacy laws. DEPA actually embeds that into the XML because the consent is granular. It is only for that particular transfer and not for anything else. And so I would say that is essentially probably the more advanced framework for privacy by design than what Anne Kevorkian first envisaged when she came up with the idea.
Right, and in many ways, it's essentially the idea of engineering privacy into the design of these technologies and looking at it in a more operational lens. So sticking with the topic of design intervention, but shifting from technology to institutional intervention, I wanted to understand from you about the institutional design changes that have been made with account aggregators. So Siddharth sort of touched upon this a little bit in his opening presentation through the idea of consent managers. In my understanding, there are also some other interventions like the public registry or the non-exclusivity agreements that exist. So how important do you think these interventions are? Do you think they also require some sort of legal backing? So for instance, the PDP bill has a passing reference to consent managers. Do you think that sort of legal backing is also required?
Okay, so look, institutions are really important. I think you've got to find the correct institutions to deliver the outcomes that you need. And so, yeah, the consent manager is a good example of an institutional innovation that the DAPA framework has brought in. And I want to dwell on it a bit because I think most people don't fully appreciate why consent manager is such a remarkable innovation. So Sid briefly mentioned two aspects of it, which is, unlike other data transfers. Okay, let's just step back. Data portability, or the right to data portability, is inherent in most modern privacy legislations. And so if you have data portability as a right, you can go to anyone who has your data and say, look, I want you to transfer my data. But if you do that without building the correct institutions, it becomes a very tedious process where if you have to, for some instance, for some innovation, if you have to get information from 3 banks, you have to go individually to each bank and say, can I get the information? Thank you very much. Transfer it. Go to the next bank. Can I get the information? Thank you very much. Transfer it. Go to the 3rd bank. And that's not at the scale of technology today. That's not operating at the scale of technology today. What the consent manager allows you to do, and what this sort of framework allows you to do, is take that consent at one time. And when you sign up, connect your consent manager to all your accounts so that you can actually don't have to go there ever again. You just have to authorize them to transfer when you want. And then the second element of that is that you create this sort of a dashboard, which you will get a list of all the transfers that have been completed ever. And that dashboard is actually another very important element of the auditability requirement. And it's non-trivial, because if you didn't have the consent manager, if Bank A transfers it to Bank B, and then subsequently Bank C transfers to Bank D, there is no smart way in which you can ever put this together unless you actually maintain the Excel sheet yourself and maintain it for the entirety of your life. And you know that no one does that, and there are mistakes that happen, and someone else does the transfer at some time, and you forget, or whatever it is, right? So those two are really important innovations. But I think the really from a privacy lawyer's perspective, the most important innovation is this ability to be double blind. And the DAPA allows this feature of double blind, which is the real reason, I think, why we can segregate the consent flows from the data flows. And if we segregate consent flows from data flows, why it is so powerful. So if you think about it, the consent manager itself is data blind. So the consent manager has no information about what it is that is passing between the FIP to the FIU. The FIP and let's not put this in the financial context, but just put it in any DAPA context, right? The person that's providing the information, DAPA can be built such that the person that's providing the information doesn't know who's requesting it. The person who's requesting the information doesn't know who's giving it to them. The consent manager who's in the middle has no information about what is traveling through them. In clinical trials, this is what's called the double blind, that you can actually carry out the experiment, and the double blind is the highest standard for confidentiality. And so the institution of a consent manager that takes consent out of the purview of the two principals, rather than the FIU asking consent from the FIP, you put a third person in, you create this confidentiality in the construction of DAPA, which is extremely powerful. And then, of course, there is this reciprocity framework that you referenced as far as the FIPs and FIUs are concerned. That's not unusual. Many people, when they want to build up a system, actually implement reciprocity as a carrot and stick to say that, if you want to participate in this, you have to contribute. If you don't contribute, you will not be allowed access. And this goes back to the days of illegal file sharing using torrents. You couldn't download a torrent unless you actually allowed your CPU to be used to also, you don't necessarily need to seed, but you would allow your CPU to be used to do the uploads, downloads while you're busy downloading your entire torrent. So that reciprocity construct is very powerful, but it's not new. Many countries are currently using that for their data transfer implementations. So just to conclude, I think we can't. And sorry, the last one, as Sid mentioned, is really Sahamati, and I hope other such SROs that in many ways are the binding feature behind these sorts of institutions, these sorts of frameworks, because as much as the technology can bind the systems, we need organizations to bind we need something to bind the organizations. And you can't do that with technology. You need to actually have some sort of a co-regulatory, self-regulatory ecosystem that's built in order to build this.
Thank you for that very comprehensive answer. Mr. Matthan made a few very interesting points there, but just one point that I wanted to discuss with Siddharth before we move on to the next theme on regulatory challenges was the point on interoperability, particularly data portability. And this is something that Vinay had also spoken about earlier. So Siddharth, I wanted to understand what is the extent of interoperability that exists within account aggregation. So, I mean, at one scale, you have simply data portability where you can only move data, but you can't move functions or features across those platforms. So does account aggregators also have like interoperability of functions, or is it just data portability?
Yeah, so the way to look at it is interoperability, two perspectives. Really, one is from a lens of interoperability, and second is non-discriminatory. And because the account aggregator is a pass-through, it's a crucial pass-through, and it should not be discriminating between different requests. And ensure that that discrimination is given through the form of agency to the user itself and no one else. And therefore, at a technical level, the interoperability, and this feeds also into the legal framework that's been designed. And it's an absolute, I'll come to that because I think it's very fascinating, and what got designed by Rahul and Pramod Rao, who's a general counsel at ICICI, along with Mahesh at Sahamati. But at the baseline, from a technology level, a user can go to an account aggregator and discover and link where all their data resides with any data provider. So that means the account aggregator is technologically interoperable with every single data provider in the ecosystem, right? So if I cannot, let's say I had an SBI account and an ICICI bank account, and let's say SBI partnered with account aggregator 1 and ICICI partnered with account aggregator 2, I'll have to go to two places, and that completely defeats the purpose of this system. So technologically, there is interoperability between the account aggregator and all the data providers. And that's an example of the network rules. That's an example of designing for the user. And if you had pure market forces at play, that would not have happened. So the US ecosystem, which is rife with bilateral contracts, they have absolutely no incentive to do something like this, right? So that's one. The second is there's interoperability between the account aggregator and the FIU, the financial information user. What that means is I can go to an FIU of my choice. Let's say, I go to a lender, and the lender cannot tell me I only support this particular account aggregator. They can, of course, get into a bilateral partnership with an account aggregator to sign on new users, right? That could be an exclusive partnership between them and the FIU, but they cannot deny me if I already have an account aggregator account. They cannot deny me access to using that particular AA service. Now, why is that important? Again, going back to the forward picture that I painted, I may have an account aggregator that is very privacy friendly. Like I may use Gmail, let's say hypothetically, but which makes money from my data and gives me ads. But you may use Proton Mail and you may pay Proton Mail, and they don't make money from your data. They're very secure and things like that. So you may have an account aggregator that fits that bill. An entrepreneur comes along and says, that's a gap in the market and I'm going to build it and I'm going to charge people for it. And I should be able to use that with any FIU. But tomorrow, if an FIU denies me access, saying, no, I do not support that account aggregator, then again, the system falls apart. So therefore, there's interoperability between the account aggregator and the FIP, and there's interoperability between the account aggregator and the FIU. And the user is the one. The account aggregator cannot discriminate on the back of requests. The user is the one who decides. The account aggregator can present information to the user to make an informed decision. Much like when you buy a consumer appliance, you have a 3-star rating or a 4-star rating. You could, of course, do those energy calculations on the back end, but most of us wouldn't. But then that abstraction through the form of these 3 or 4 stars influences our purchase decision. Similarly, if you have a data consumer that is known to be very leaky with your data, to be subject to a lot of breaches, then that could have a 1-star rating attached to it. Or someone might decide tomorrow as a network rule, just like browsers, if you don't have a TLS certificate, we will block users from accessing that website, because as a whole, this is important for security of users and of the network, even though it may hurt business interests. So those are examples of the agency that the user has on the back of interoperability that's designed within the technical standards. And this same interoperability carries forward into the procedural guidelines that have been created by the ecosystem. These are ecosystem terms of service. And so it's an absolutely amazing legal architecture that Rahul and Pramod Rao and Mahesh and the rest of the team have arrived at, because there are absolutely no bilateral contracts. So the account aggregator is not sitting. So let's say, for example, one of us on this call decides to start an account aggregator tomorrow, right? And you want them, they're starting it, let's say, from their dorm room or now from their bedroom, and they don't have the ability to walk into these bank offices and strike bilateral contracts saying, please go ahead and partner with me, right? And the bank will say, I've already partnered with 1 or 2 account aggregators, go to hell. But they're saying, no, I'm creating this particular account aggregator that's very privacy focused. The bank says, I don't really give a damn. So therefore, the legal construct that has been created is so important, because it says that anyone that becomes an account aggregator satisfying RBI's guidelines, now once you sign up to these terms of service, gets access to the entire network, right? So at one shot, therefore, you don't have to go around. And tomorrow, let's say there are 100 FIPs or 1,000 FIPs. You cannot sign bilateral contracts with 1,000 FIPs, but you sign this ecosystem terms of service. It establishes liability in a very clear manner, yet it preserves the interoperability that I spoke about at a technological level, even at a legal level. So that's how we've thought about interoperability at the various layers within the system. And our view is that's core to this actually, with interoperability built in, is how the market expansion will take place, how diverse users will be managed. Otherwise, you will have a lot of fragmentation that kicks in.
I found a lot of those points to be really interesting, especially how we can use consumer psychology as another regulatory lever. And that's something that interoperability also allows us control over. So I think with that, we've had a very comprehensive understanding of the regulatory advantages that come from the account aggregators. So we can finally move on to the last theme, which we'll try to wrap up to the last 4 questions to each of the panelists. Again, really sorry for extending time. I hope all of you can take out another 15 minutes to wrap the session up. All right, so seeing that there are no objections, I'll take that as a yes. And the first question that with that, my first question on this last theme is to Mr. Mahesh. Both Mr. Matthan and Siddharth had echoed the sentiment that self-regulatory organizations like Sahamati have a huge role to play. So I want to understand from you as the co-founder, what role do you see Sahamati playing? And do you think there are any inherent pitfalls to self-regulation that will require the government to step in?
Sure. See, okay, to start with, I should inform you that, Sahamati is not yet an SRO. And as of now, we are a collective of this entire account aggregator ecosystem, as I said. So, but to have an a collective like this becomes very important, especially now in the initial stages. Okay, because you have, we had few of the account aggregators, you had the banks, NBFCs, and it became very important to bring everybody under the one roof to start this implementation. So what is our exact role, is that, yeah, Revit has already published all the standards. So, it is not from Sahamati. Okay. But how do we know when the market is implementing it, these standards, that they are doing according to the standards? It has to adhere to the standards. Otherwise, everybody will be going in all in all directions. The thing will not flow in a very smooth way. You don't know what data is coming. So we actually come up with some operational guidelines. So basically we come up with a lot of guidelines and also the norms. To give an example, like if we, we recommend that they all get certified, because it actually looks into the API implementation, whether you have done it properly or not. A very simple example, I'll tell, like when a bank will request for your statement for 1 month, the FIP should send the statement for 1 month and not for 1 year. Okay, and it has to be encrypted when it is sent to FIU. It should not be in a clear text. Now, otherwise, again, you have a problem. Okay. We also come up with the service level commitments or the SLAs. But all these things, what we actually come up with, the guidelines or the norms, is that we work with the ecosystem. We work with them to see, are they all okay with these common guidelines? Okay, again, I repeat, the actual standards are from Revit. We work on the implementation to make sure it is according to the standards. Now, why are all this important? Because the end user should not have a poor experience. Okay, because especially now in the very initial stage, if they don't stick to these guidelines, everything goes wrong and it won't take off. Now, about the pitfall. Now, I'll have to say that we are working a lot with all these entities, the account aggregators, the FIPs, FIUs. So we should not get blinded about the end consumer. Okay, because we are so occupied with all these people, we must keep in mind that, okay, we need to look into the needs of the consumer. So there has to be a way for the end consumer to give us the feedback. I've used this, I've used that, it is not working. And, like as I informed you earlier, the use cases are the ones which are very important for this AA framework or any framework. Only then you'll know how well it is doing. But we have observed when the new use cases come up, there is a need for an updation or introduction of new standards. So you will just see within a year, I'm telling you, there'll be a lot more new use cases which will come up. But then will the ecosystem, be able to keep up, okay, to the demand, and will they update the standards, at the same pace? If they are not able to, okay, then the government or the regulator will have to step in to make sure these changes are happening, according to what the market demands. And lastly, I would say that obviously, the main goal of DEPA or account aggregator is is actually data democratization and credit democratization. Okay, but what if we are not able to deliver it? I mean, you may have account aggregators, you may have banks, everything looks good, but the intended result is we are not able to see. When all these things happen, I would say that the government would intervene to say that, hey, this is all good, but the result is something else and we had planned for something else. But we can avoid all these things, as I said, when, we all, including Sahamati or the ecosystem, because we work with the ecosystem, I would say we should be open to constructive criticism. We should actually get feedback and we should implement that feedback. It should not simply be in some research paper and it is there in some library. It needs to get implemented because the end consumer has to benefit.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think you've given us, especially at the end, a really good perspective and mindset of how to look at these things, especially from the regulator side. With that, I want to ask Ms. Singh her final question. This draws from the paper that you and Ms. Raghavan had written about what really the consequences of a central bank regulating a data intermediary as an NBFC, and does this have larger digital economy implications beyond the financial sector that can be harmful?
Thank you, Ankit. Yeah, so this was the exact question we kind of posed in the paper as well, and I think some of the people in the panel may have read it. I think we took a rather strong stance within the paper with respect to what we think are the implications of a central bank regulating data flows, because since then we've had multiple conversations. I think we've had a conversation with you, Mahesh, with respect to these implications, and I think if we really look at it, there is precedence for sectoral entities controlling information in the past as well, right? Because RBI has obviously been doing it with respect to the reporting requirements from its various entities that it regulates. We have CICs that deal with financial information, which are also regulated entities. We have the NSDL that does it, and then we all are aware about Aadhaar anyway. So even as we see the movements in the Personal Data Protection Bill, which will be a horizontal regulation, it was always imagined that each regulatory system would create its own sector-specific guidelines that are most appropriate to the entities that are within their sector. So I don't think the consequences are first very impactful, and secondly, I don't think they're harmful at this point anyway. But there is definitely a very strong requirement for kind of interagency coordination to happen, because at the moment, as we said, that it was agreed upon by all the financial regulators in the ecosystem. But since then, we've only seen kind of the RBI making policy movements and kind of master directions on the same. So even though the use cases are currently limited to, say, probably credit and within the banking sector, at some point we do expect the account aggregator to have larger user cases, maybe have more kind of entities come in from the security sector, from the pension system. So at that point, I think it'll be very important to see how these financial sector regulators kind of interact within themselves. But also when you have a larger kind of data protection authority on the top, which is regulating for all of the sectors and therefore also the financial sector, I think it'll be important to see how the account aggregator kind of as a consent manager would be interacting with the DPA as well, because they have registration requirements. Again, we don't know what the kind of impact of such registration requirement or accountability for the same might be. But there is definitely requirement for that kind of coordination. And I think one more thing that we kind of anticipate, and it's not something we've thought about, so maybe the panelists can answer it once I've dropped off, is also kind of the grievance management that would occur with account aggregators. So as we know, account aggregators themselves are not really seeing any information. They're just transferring information between entities. However, I think there is kind of something to think about the liability when wrong information may have been transferred. Who's going to take care of that? Is it even the account aggregator's job, given that they're not actually seeing the data? So I think it's important to kind of point to the consumers of account aggregators what the kind of recourse mechanism might be in such cases if there has been kind of a harm due to the information that's been passed by account aggregators. And the simple reason I say this is because the user is just using the front end of the account aggregator. They know the company they might be dealing with. They might not know the back end at the very end. So, okay. Mahesh says every account aggregator needs to appoint a grievance officer as per the master directions. Okay, so that's my bad. But yeah, so I don't think there are any kind of harms that I'm anticipating from this, except for the privacy kind of aspects that Rahul already spoke about and we already know are covered in detail in both the tech specs as well as the master directions.
Right. Thanks a lot, Ms. Singh, and also for staying for this additional 10 minutes.
No, thank you so much. Okay, I'm just going to drop off.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
With that, I wanted to move to Mr. Matthan and understand from him. So throughout this panel, Mr. Mahesh especially has been echoing the sentiment that nations around the world have been looking at account aggregators and trying to implement some parts of that within their context. But flipping this discussion, are there any other comparative data sharing projects of this scale in the financial sector around the world that we can take inspiration from? I had vaguely heard of something happening in Bahrain and the EU. Is there something that we can borrow from there?
That's probably going to be a very short answer. I think no. Not out of any blind patriotism, but just the thing that Mai said right in the beginning, right? I mean, no one has the ability to do it at this scale. There is no one who can turn on a system and have 300 million accounts potentially affected. And it's exponential because it's not just 300 million base accounts, but it's the connections between them that make this exponential. And you have to exponentially multiply 300 million with the number of consent managers, with the number of some of these are banks which are very much focused with traditional lendings. Others are very aggressive NBFCs that are looking for very innovative products and solutions. We are all thinking about lending, but there are so many other use cases. I mentioned one, which is this self-securitization. Others will do wealth management. There will be cross-sectoral implications between insurance and pensions and banks. And then the mother lode of it all is when you're going to link the financial data to the health data. And so medical insurance companies will actually be able to access the medical data from the health data ecosystem. And when all of that happens and you think about what we've built here, and the question is, can we get inspiration from anyone else? I think the problem, and it's not anyone else's fault, it's just that we have numbers at this scale that we have to, when we build, think very differently. And so even if we want to try and look, and to be honest, and maybe Sid, you can give more technical details about this, but when you look at the UK's open banking, which is often considered to be a close parallel to what we are doing, when you look at it in detail, it is actually just touching the surface of what it is that the account aggregator framework is doing. So I think there are many people that are thinking along these lines. There are many people that are taking steps along these lines. So Europe certainly is one. They've got a new, several probably regimes. They've got the Data Act that's coming up. They've got the Data Governance Act that's coming up. The Data Governance Act actually makes reference to intermediated data transfers, which sounds very similar to our consent manager intermediation. But when you look into it in some detail, it's not exactly the same thing or not articulated in the same way. Australia has got the consumer data right. That is very much a data transfer framework. In other ways, it's like us because they went into the banking sector and they mobilized bank by bank in much the same way as Sid and Mahesh, and everyone has been speaking with the banks and saying, come on board. But they don't have a consent manager, so it's once again direct bank transfer. So I think if you look at the world, you'll see lots of people thinking along these lines, which is great because it shows that there's a commonality in the understanding. I think the next step right now is for all of us to come together and for all of us to learn from each other to say that, look, what you're solving, you can solve in a microcosm. And if we've got within India a really small ecosystem that needs a DEPA implementation, maybe we can learn from Australia's implementation because they have a much smaller population. And for that niche DEPA, we may need to not build at this, the things that we've had to do at scale. And other countries, like, if you want to do it in Africa or things like that, can look to our implementation and say, look, this is how you build for scale. And maybe in Africa, we don't want to do it country by country, but we want to do it for the whole African Union. And that's sort of a different level of scale. So I think the short answer to your question was no. The slightly medium-sized answer to your question is that there are lots of similarities, but nothing identical, and that's actually great because we do want to have that diversity. What we need to do is to agree on a common minimum, because I think the next stage of all of this once we've cracked national data transfers, is to make international data transfers completely interoperable in much the same way as today financial data flows are completely interoperable. Eventually, if all data transfers can become completely interoperable, we'll get the benefits that we see today with SWIFT and all these payment networks, also applying to data in any form.
Thank you, Mr. Matthan, for that extremely insightful and comprehensive answer. I think with that, we can move to Siddharth for his comments. And I also had one final question for Siddharth, which will be the final question for today. So Siddharth, in addition to your comments, if you could just touch upon this question too. So I wanted to understand the different challenges that cross-sectoral entities face while getting onto the account aggregator ecosystem. So for instance, how would the comparative look like for a bank and an insurance company if they want to get onto this ecosystem?
Sure, I think I'll answer that and then added my comment, which is actually a bit of angst towards the previous question you asked, Rahul. Very simply put, like Mahesh mentioned early on, the only reason this effort started with banking is purely because that's the largest sector that exists. And so most of the problems will be discovered first up within banking when it's rolling out for 500 million active bank accounts versus securities where you still have 19, 20 million mutual fund accounts now probably would have increased post-COVID, and insurance where it's an even smaller number. So really the challenges remain the same in terms of, technology challenges, market incentives, and so on. But what's happened is many of these sectors have, as they witnessed the banking rollout, you've got to understand that most of the large players in these other sectors are actually sister companies or subsidiaries of the players in the banking space, right? So SBI runs SBI Bank, but also SBI Mutual Fund, same with HDFC, similar with Kotak, and many of the other players, or they are investors in related companies in these sectors. So there is a sufficient flow of information and knowledge already taking place around the challenges, and therefore these entities are already getting prepared to address them. Within the securities ecosystem, they're thinking of a common shared infrastructure. Within insurance, you already have insurance repositories. So each insurer will not have to do it themselves. The repositories will plug in as agents of the insurer. So that's already being thought about. So in my view, at least, within the financial space, the effort actually decreases, because what also happens is solutions built for banks, let's say, a particular technology product now becomes available, in some cases at even lower costs, to those in the other ecosystems, right? So it actually becomes cheaper, it becomes far more convenient. A lot of the messiness has gone away. You now have a fairly well-baked solution that you can consume and eat. But of course, broader, if you broaden it beyond finance, when it becomes between health and finance, let's say I want to share my health data with a particular insurer, the implications of that, and that cross-sectoral data sharing is where you'd see more challenges come about. So between health, finance, and telecom, these are very different ecosystems. And I think that's where more effort needs to go in. Not really, I think it's just going to become, trend line will be a lot easier within the financial space between banking, securities, insurance. So that's my quick answer to the second question that you asked. But the question that you asked, Rahul, which was, where do we look for inspiration from? That actually created a whole bunch of angst within me, is because, we are charting new territory. As Rahul has said time and again, we are charting new territory. And the only place you can look for inspiration is within oneself, right? You cannot look for inspiration externally in this context, because you are at the frontier. And therefore, it's important that to think about it from the standpoint of how you want this system, right? So we would want a system where, we go to an account aggregator and are able to discover all our accounts. We would not want a system where, I go to an AA and then I have to go to 3 AAs, for example, to link 3 different bank accounts. And then you reflect that as part of the legal and technological design, saying the protocol should support that. Now that the protocol support that, the overarching contractual framework should support that as well. And maybe the contractual framework hasn't been built before because all you have in law offices are bilateral contracts. So let's create a new one from scratch, right? That will probably, the only folks that can opine on the legal validity of it is the Supreme Court, because it's that first principles, right? So I think it's important to really to understand that and get out of this mindset, because if I ask most of you on the call, you would give me parroted answers about GDPR, right? And all the other legislation across the world. Parroted answers on how it works, pros and cons of GDPR, and so on, right? Little to realize that 5 years later, GDPR is a failure. So most of what one may have studied or your questions asked by your professors in your exam is actually moot, right? So the work that's happening here will actually be in textbooks 10 years down the line, right? That's what happens when you're in the front. You cannot look at textbooks and hunt around in your textbooks to find these answers. Of course, one would have learned sufficient amount of first principles that you'll be able to build this from, but that's a very important realization and acceptance that one needs to take on as you think about these systems, right? And so therefore, for a lot of you that are on the call, it's important to shift from purely being interpreters of what is out there, right? Just interpreting, okay, GDPR is like this, these are the various clauses, this is how it helps. You know, that's fairly junk knowledge. It's helpful to some extent, but otherwise fairly junk knowledge. And what we really need is people who start to build these new systems, right? And there are many gaps that exist. It could be what happens if an account aggregator goes rogue, right? And all the protections, technological and institutional protections we talk about actually become a failure. So someone who's deeply skeptical could actually think about that and write about that, right? Or if this becomes a global data empowerment regime, what are the core legal constructs that would actually make that happen, right? Let's say I share my data. We are saying there'll be interoperability between, forget sectors, but between countries. Now, let's say I share my health data from India with an entity in the US, a set of doctors in the US for a teleconsultation. Now, what happens in case a breach takes place, right? How do you think about that? How do you think about it in a way that actually protects the consumer across these boundaries? A smaller version of that will happen within different sectors, right? What happens if, you know, a lot of you will have great interpretations on data localization norms, but that also becomes moot if you have a consent system, right? So what happens in that case? And how does one think about data localization or a new paradigm where that's not even required because it brings a whole bunch of other risks, right? So I think it's important to start to think about, you know, even questions around the business model, right? And how do you ensure that the AA is really, from a legal perspective, incentive aligned with the user? And tomorrow, you know, neither can any other market player usurp that principle, or even the state, right? Where in certain cases they've intervened to make things free, compulsory, and we know that actually hurts the ecosystem in the long run, right? So what are those protections? I think a lot of that thinking is actually what we are looking to hear from. And that cannot happen. You know, a private company cannot sit around thinking about these. They're just going to go with what exists. Sahamati can do parts of that, right? But you guys in a university setup have the ability to think about these things, besides for just studying about GDPR and then, you know, parroting that out back in an exam paper a few months later. And that opportunity is available because there's a space for absorption of these ideas within the system today. And if those answers are available, they will be absorbed.
And I just want to add that at least some of them have been taught by me, so they know already.
No, and therefore, and that's important. So we need many more Rahul Matthans within the system. That's my exact point.
I think we have a few in the pipeline, so hopefully they turn out to be as good as the original target that we're aiming for. But I think you raised a very fundamental point there that we need to change our thought process and our cognitive approach to a lot of these things. And hopefully that's the direction we can take going forward. So with that, we come to an end for this panel discussion. And as for audience Q&A, thankfully, all of you have been very proactive in responding on chat itself. So I don't think we need to reserve any separate time. But what I was thinking was that we could probably have a 90-second to 120-second closing remarks from the three of you. Where if there's something from the audience remarks that piqued your interest, you could perhaps engage with that or just give us your concluding thoughts. So I think since Mr. Matthan had an issue with going last first time, we'll probably start.
No, I have no issue going last or first, but just to say, look, I think the point is that we're at the start of a journey. As much as this is now, what was it, Sid, 2017 that we started this? So it feels like this should be the end of some sort when we launched, but this is really only the beginning. I think once again, as Sid said, we're likely to see some of this in textbooks. I mean, it could be, this is how, you should not build a techno-legal, or whatever it is. The thing that we're doing is at such a large scale that there is no doubt that this is something that we will see discussed in the future, hopefully for good. So I'm really glad that we're having these sorts of conversations. I hope law school will take up more of these and study this in more detail.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Mahesh, if we could hear from you.
Sure. I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say after I've heard from Sid and Rahul, but all I can say is that we are at a stage from here. You will see this. The entire thing will actually take off in a very big way, like in a year or two. Okay, the actual journey has already started, and we would like to hear from the skeptics, critics, whatever it is, that is there something we can do to improve it further? And I mean, we are always open to feedback, so would love to hear from that. And thank you for having me.
It was our pleasure to host you, sir. Siddharth, if we could hear from you to close the session today.
Yeah, I think thank you for, it's amazing that you guys have put this together, particularly on this fairly nuanced topic, bridging techno-legal, data protection, data empowerment, new institutions that are being created. And my only thing is, for you guys to actually, as you perceive some of these various gaps that are out there or areas of interest, to start contributing back to that knowledge pool, building that knowledge pool out. Whether it's through the questions that are being asked or answers to some of those questions as well. And it's very clear that for us who are operating kind of at this frontier, that there are enormous gaps. And so I second what Rahul outlined, which is, it seems like a long journey. The launch should have been a culmination, but it just purely seems like day one, we're just starting off, and that sense continues to remain. And so I think that's really, it's a really a great space to for new ideas to come in, and these ideas to travel within the Indian ecosystem and become part of that social fabric and across the world as well.
Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. And I wanted to thank each of you, and also Vinay and Anubhutie, who had to leave a little earlier, for taking out the time and engaging with us in so much nuance and diversity. One of our objectives was, of course, to generate awareness about the account aggregators within the legal and law school community. But the other objective we had was to generate research outputs. One of the things we will be doing in the next week is the questions that we've asked you. We'll be preparing a comprehensive conference report with all of the responses that you've given us, and we'll be circulating it amongst other experts within this field as well for their inputs. And hopefully we could put that out and get greater responses from the communities out there, and also contribute to existing literature and take some of these conversations and criticisms forward. So thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us today. It was a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.